To discuss that further, we're joined by Paolo Raffone, Secretary General of the CIPI Foundation in Brussels. Also, we have with us Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist from Auckland. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for joining us. Let's begin with Mr. Raffone. The U.S. has been pushing to blame Russia and the Ukraine war for the global economic slowdown, but it looks like the G20 members are divided over that issue. Even the draft declaration states that there were different assessments of the situation and the sanctions. How do you evaluate the G20 stance?
Well, it is not surprising that at the G20 there has been a replica of what has happened consistently in the UN General Assembly. Just a few days ago, there was a vote on a resolution in the General Assembly, which was voted by 94 countries, requesting Russia to repay for the destruction of Ukraine. But 98 countries, between those against, abstained, or not present, didn't support this resolution. And this is a consistent situation, so we have a split in the world, and this has reflected in the G20 too. That's why the draft text, which is yet to be adopted, is relatively vague. It just says that the war is not good for the stability of the world economy.
So, Mr. Gosling, in his address to the summit, Zelensky called for an end to the war, but insisted that there will not be a Minsk III agreement, making it clear that he wants peace based on Ukrainian formula. What do you think that will happen or not?
Well, look, first of all, you've got to point out that it was Petro Poroshenko, his predecessor, that broke the Minsk agreement. The 15,000 or so people who've been dying in the southeast of Ukraine ever since the Minsk agreement was signed have been killed not by the Russians but by his own government, the Kiev government. He doesn't seem to recognize this. The idea, of course, is really just to keep this war going. Zelensky doesn't really seem to care too much for his own people because he's taking on this massive superpower in a war that he can't possibly win in the long term without the support from many of these other countries. But I'd also ask, what is Zelensky doing there? Ukraine is not one of the G20 nations. If we're going to be looking at the various conflicts around the planet, why is not the president of the Yemen giving addresses in a similar fashion and getting similar form of publicity? Because many would argue that the Yemen conflict will be much easier to sort out and to settle by these powerful countries. So I noticed also that the British Prime Minister, the new one, Rishi Sunak, is there. He's saying, trying to turn this really into a discussion all about the Ukraine war. He's saying Russia won't hold Britain hostage. Well, Russia is not holding Britain hostage. Britain has held itself hostage over energy prices by slapping all these sanctions on. And the people who seem to be really in charge, I notice, have just reported record profits, double the profits of last year. Companies like Shell, the energy fossil fuel companies, are doing incredibly well out of the so-called holding hostage of Britain. Maybe it's them. Maybe it's the energy companies that are actually holding Britain hostage, as their profits have doubled to, and this is profit, not a turnover, £32 billion, Shell's annual profit, which is around $40 billion. And that's doubled in just 1 year. So the shareholders of the big energy companies are very happy, even if Rishi Sunak is supposedly not.
So, Mr. Raffone, in your opinion, why did Putin decide to stay out of this summit? Is he relying on Russia's allies like China, for instance, to control the situation and prevent a condemnation of Russia's role in the food crisis?
Well, this is something that should be asked to the Kremlin. I don't know why he has decided not to participate in person there, but he sent his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov, who kept quite a sideline position in the G20. I think there was no need to expose further Russia in that consensus because the position of Russia is quite clear, and the hint that comes from such a decision is that Russia is self-isolating from the international community, at least for the moment.
Thank you. And Mr. Gosling, finally, India is known to have good relations with Russia. So is China. In their meeting in Bali, Francis Macron has called on China's Xi to bring Putin to the negotiating table. How do you assess the role of India and China as possible negotiators for peace?
Well, that is, of course, possible, but all the time that NATO and their very close buddy Zelensky are insistent on not negotiating. I mean, actually, this war in Ukraine could be over tomorrow if there was people who were prepared to get around the table. But I think the reason Putin is not there in Bali is because he doesn't see much future with the G20 summits, rather like some of the other summits which happen, which are basically organised by, I mean, look at who it was that founded the G20. It was the IMF and the World Trade Organization. Both of those are Western sponsored, or begun anyway, and largely Western controlled organizations. And so is the G20. I mean, there's even the ridiculous situation where you've got the European Union and the French and the Germans and the Italians, etc., all there. And so all of those European countries, they get an extra vote. They get an extra place at the table because the EU there is too, as a separate country, with the president of Europe, who nobody in Europe has actually elected Ursula von der Leyen to be there. But anyway, the point is that this is seen by the Russians and the Chinese, I'm sure, and the Turks and many others around the world as a Western-sponsored organisation, a globalist place where they will come and they will get their orders from the likes of the IMF, etc. And in a way, it's a competitor to places like the United Nations, where there are actually much fairer debates, and it's much more of a level playing field. It's rather like, there are all sorts of organisations, I think, around the world that are similar to this. And this is a more open organisation, but the G20, it looks to me rather like a sort of more open version of things like the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberg Conference, which are NATO-based countries behind it, even though more are included, and that's why I think Putin isn't going to go there, because he sees the future as around the world as things like the United Nations and the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, because the West is simply not prepared to do deals with the Russians, and they're completely focused on having and supporting Zelensky in this war in Ukraine. And with that obsession, they're actually not people that you can do deals with. So I think it's quite clear. And I noticed also that in the press here, I'm not sure about in other parts of the world, we had all this stuff about Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, being taken to hospital. Well, the Russians then simply put out obviously that's the Western press doing that, and the Western intelligence services. And so the Russians put out a little short video with Sergei Lavrov, the greatest chess player on planet Earth, I would argue, just sitting and enjoying the sun on his veranda at Bali, saying, well, as far as I know, I have not been taken to hospital so far. So you can see they're dealing with effectively a kind of gaslighting organisation, which is the Western media, saying things that are simply not true, like this whole thing from Sunak. Russia won't hold Britain hostage. Well, this is just gaslighting from the Western media. And that's why I think people like Putin and many other millions around the world don't take these sorts of summits very seriously anymore.
Thank you very much to Mr. Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist from Auckland, and also Paulo Raffone, Secretary General of the CIPI Foundation from Brussels. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of the News Review. And
Cheers.
Thanks to all of our viewers for watching this edition.